On the morning of November 15, 1965, Police Constable Michael Thornton pushed open the front door of 47 Elm Street in the quiet village of Ashworth, Lancashire. The Higgins family, Harold, Margaret, and their 3 children, had missed Sunday service for the second week running. Their neighbors were concerned. Their milk bottles had piled up on the doorstep. The curtains remained drawn. What P.C. Thornton discovered inside defied every assumption about this respectable working-class family. 3 breakfast plates sat on the kitchen table, still set for a meal that was never eaten. Upstairs, the children's beds were neatly made. Harold's work clothes hung pressed and ready in the wardrobe. Margaret's handbag sat on the dressing table, her weekly shopping money still folded inside. The Higgins family had simply vanished. No note. No struggle. No sign of forced entry, as if they had stepped out of their lives and into thin air. But the truth behind their disappearance was far more terrifying than anyone in Ashworth could have imagined. Before we uncover the dark truth about the Higgins family's fate, make sure to subscribe to the Lost Relics and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's most disturbing mysteries. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's step back into 1965 and discover what really happened on Elm Street. England in 1965 stood at a crossroads between the old world and the new. Harold Wilson had just swept into Downing Street with promises of technological revolution and social progress. The Beatles dominated the airwaves. Young people across the nation were embracing a cultural liberation that would have scandalized their parents just a decade earlier. Yet beneath this veneer of modernization, traditional English society clung desperately to its familiar structures. Lancashire, in particular, remained largely untouched by the swinging 60s that captured London's imagination. Mill towns like Ashworth operated according to rhythms established during the Industrial Revolution. Men worked the same shifts their fathers had worked. Women kept house and raised children according to patterns passed down through generations. Sunday church attendance remained a cornerstone of respectability, and gossip traveled faster than news. Ashworth itself was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. A village of perhaps 2,000 souls, it nestled in the valley between Manchester and Preston, connected to the wider world by a single railway line and a narrow road that wound through the moors. The village centre consisted of a small high street with essential shops: the baker, the butcher, the post office that doubled as a general store. 2 pubs served the working men, the Crown and Anchor for the respectable types, the Railway Arms for those whose reputations had suffered various small damages over the years. Most residents had been born in Ashworth and would die there. They measured their lives in familiar landmarks: the Victorian church with its distinctive stone spire, the old cotton mill that still employed half the village, the grammar school where bright children might earn their ticket to better prospects in the cities. Change came slowly here, and that's exactly how most people preferred it. The Higgins family seemed to embody everything solid and dependable about Ashworth life. Harold Higgins, 42 years old, had worked at Blackwood Mill for over 20 years, rising to the position of floor supervisor through steady dedication rather than brilliance. His colleagues described him as reliable, quiet, and fair in his dealings with the men under his supervision. He'd served in the war, Italy and then Germany, and returned home with the same steady temperament he'd possessed when he left. Never one for the pub on Friday nights. Harold preferred his garden and his wireless programs. Margaret Higgins, 38, had been Margaret Ashworth before her marriage, a fact that automatically elevated her status in village society. The Ashworths were Old Ashworth, if you will, their family name literally woven into the town's identity. She'd been considered quite a catch when Harold proposed in 1943, and their marriage had been celebrated as a perfect match of steady character and local prominence. Margaret kept an immaculate house, participated in church committees, and maintained the kind of garden that other women envied but would never openly praise. Their 3 children completed this portrait of domestic stability. Thomas, 16, showed promise at the grammar school and harbored ambitions of attending university, a dream that would have been laughable for Harold's generation but seemed increasingly possible in Wilson's Britain. Elizabeth, 14, possessed her mother's quiet elegance and her father's steady temperament. Young Robert, only 8, was the family's charmer, beloved by neighbors for his polite manner and bright smile. The Higgins family attended St. Michael's Church every Sunday morning, sitting in the same pew they'd occupied for 15 years. They took their annual holiday in Blackpool, staying at the same boarding house each August. Harold cycled to work every morning at precisely 7:30, returning home at precisely 6:15 for tea. Margaret shopped at the same stores on the same days each week, exchanging pleasantries with the same shopkeepers who'd known her since childhood. Yet those who looked closely might have noticed subtle changes in recent months. Margaret's participation in church committees had become perfunctory. Harold, never talkative, had grown even more withdrawn. The family had declined several social invitations, citing various minor ailments or previous commitments. Young Robert's bright chatter had quieted. Thomas spent more time alone in his room, claiming to study but sometimes sitting silently at his window. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, who lived next door at number 45, would later tell investigators that she'd grown concerned about the Higgins family's increasing isolation. They were always quiet people, she explained, but there's a difference between quiet and absent. It was as if they were all somewhere else. Even when they were right there in their garden, the changes had been so gradual, so subtle, that most neighbors attributed them to the usual stresses of family life. Harold was working longer hours as the mill struggled with increased competition. Margaret was dealing with the challenges of raising teenagers. The children were growing up, becoming less outwardly affectionate. Nothing seemed alarming enough to warrant concern. Besides, Ashworth prided itself on respecting privacy. Good neighbors minded their own business. If the Higgins family was going through a rough patch, they would work it out themselves. That was the English way. This collective decision to look the other way, to rationalize away their growing unease, would haunt the village for decades. Because while everyone was politely ignoring the signs that something was deeply wrong, the Higgins family was slowly disappearing even before they physically vanished. The question that would torment investigators wasn't just where the family had gone. It was how 5 people could fade so completely from their own lives without anyone noticing until it was far too late. The first crack in the Higgins family's facade of normalcy appeared on a Tuesday evening in late September 1965. Mrs. Eleanor Whitworth, the village postmistress, was closing her shop when she heard raised voices from the direction of Elm Street. This was unusual enough in quiet Ashworth, but what struck her as genuinely odd was that one of the voices belonged to Harold Higgins, a man she'd never heard raise his voice in 20 years of acquaintance. "I won't have it." Harold's voice carried clearly through the evening air. "Not in my house. Not with my children." Mrs. Whitworth paused in locking her shop door, straining to hear more. Margaret's voice responded, but too quietly to make out words. Then Harold again, his tone sharp with an emotion she couldn't identify. "You think I don't know what you've been doing? You think I'm blind?" The voices moved inside, and Mrs. Whitworth heard no more. She mentioned the incident to her sister, who suggested that every marriage went through difficult patches. "Even the Higgins," her sister observed. "They're only human after all." But Mrs. Whitworth couldn't shake her unease. In all her years of knowing Harold, she'd never heard him speak with such vehemence. The tone had been wrong somehow, not angry exactly, but desperate, frightened. 2 weeks later, young Robert Higgins failed to appear at school. When the headmaster, Mr. Geoffrey Pearson, telephoned the house, Margaret apologized profusely and explained that Robert had come down with a stomach bug. "Quite poorly," she said. "The doctor thinks it best he stay home for a few days." Dr. James Morrison, the village's only physician, was surprised to learn he'd supposedly diagnosed Robert Higgins. He'd seen no member of the Higgins family in months. When he mentioned this to his wife over dinner, she suggested that Margaret might have consulted a doctor in Preston, rather than bother him with a minor childhood ailment. Robert returned to school after a week's absence, but his teacher, Miss Patricia Henley, noticed significant changes in the boy's behavior. "He'd always been one of our brightest," she later told investigators. Eager to answer questions, quick with his sums, always ready with a story about something he'd seen or done at home. But when he came back, it was as if someone had turned down the volume on Robert's personality. The boy who had once chattered enthusiastically about his father's garden and his mother's baking now sat quietly at his desk, completing assignments with mechanical precision. When Miss Henley asked about his illness, Robert simply nodded and said he felt better now. When she inquired about his family, his answers became monosyllabic. It was the eyes. Miss Henley would remember years later. Robert had always had such bright, curious eyes. But when he came back to school, there was something guarded about them, as if he was watching everything very carefully, but not in the way a curious child watches. More like, she struggled for the right words, like he was watching for danger. The third incident occurred on a Friday evening in early October. The Ashworth Women's Institute was holding its monthly meeting in the church hall, and Margaret Higgins had been expected to present her annual report on the Christmas charity drive. When she failed to appear, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher volunteered to walk over to Elm Street and check on her neighbor. Mrs. Fletcher found Margaret in her garden, ostensibly tending to the late-season roses. But she was working in the dark with only the weak light from the kitchen window to guide her. She seemed startled when Mrs. Fletcher called her name over the garden fence. "Oh, Dorothy," Margaret said, brushing dirt from her hands. "I'd quite forgotten about the meeting. Are you feeling all right, dear?" Mrs. Fletcher asked. "You look rather pale." Margaret assured her that she was fine, simply tired from a busy week. But Mrs. Fletcher noticed that Margaret's hands were shaking, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. More unsettling still, Margaret seemed to be having difficulty following the conversation, responding to questions several seconds after they were asked, as if she were listening to voices Mrs. Fletcher couldn't hear. "Is Harold at home?" Mrs. Fletcher inquired, growing more concerned. "Harold?" Margaret repeated the name as if she'd never heard it before. Then her expression cleared. "Oh yes, Harold's inside with the children. They're working on something together." Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward the house. The downstairs windows were dark except for the kitchen, and she could see no movement inside. The whole house had an empty feeling that didn't match Margaret's words about her family being home together. "Perhaps you should come inside," Mrs. Fletcher suggested. "You're shivering?" Margaret looked down at herself as if surprised to discover she was cold. She was wearing only a thin dress despite the October chill, and her feet were bare in the damp garden soil. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes, I should go inside." But she made no move toward the house. She simply stood there in the dark garden, staring at Mrs. Fletcher with an expression that was somehow both vacant and intensely focused. Mrs. Fletcher found herself backing away from the fence. There was something fundamentally wrong with Margaret's behavior, something that went beyond tiredness or illness. It was as if Margaret Higgins was slowly becoming someone, or something else entirely. The fourth and most disturbing incident occurred on the last Saturday in October. Thomas Higgins, who had been accepted to Cambridge pending his A-level results, was expected at the grammar school for a scholarship interview. This was the kind of opportunity that came perhaps once in a generation to a boy from Ashworth. And Thomas had been preparing for months. He never arrived. When the headmaster telephoned, Harold answered and calmly explained that Thomas had decided not to pursue university after all. "Changed his mind," Harold said. "Wants to follow his old dad into mill work instead. Good honest labor, that. Better than filling his head with ideas above his station." The headmaster, Mr. Pearson, was stunned. He'd known Thomas for 6 years and had never encountered a student more determined to escape the limitations of village life. Thomas had spoken passionately about studying literature, about traveling, about seeing the world beyond the Lancashire moors. The idea that he would voluntarily abandon his scholarship opportunity was incomprehensible. "Perhaps I could speak with Thomas directly," Mr. Pearson suggested. "He's not here," Harold replied immediately. "Gone to help his uncle with some work in Manchester. Won't be back for several days." Mr. Pearson knew the Higgins family had no relations in Manchester. Harold's people had all died in the war, and Margaret's family, the Ashworths, had never left the village. He also knew that Thomas had been planning to spend the weekend reviewing his scholarship materials. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Mr. Pearson decided to visit Elm Street personally. He arrived on Sunday afternoon, timing his visit for after-church services when the family would surely be home. He knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. Through the front window, he could see the sitting room appeared undisturbed, cushions perfectly arranged, not a book or newspaper out of place. It looked like a room in which no one lived. Walking around to the back garden, Mr. Pearson peered through the kitchen window. The room was immaculate, but he noticed something odd about the breakfast table. 3 place settings were arranged with mathematical precision, but there were 5 chairs. 2 chairs sat empty, pushed back from the table as if their occupants had just stepped away. 5 chairs for a family of 5. But only 3 places set for breakfast. As he stood there trying to make sense of what he was seeing, movement caught his eye. In the upstairs window, Thomas's bedroom, a face appeared briefly behind the curtains. But the angle was wrong somehow. The face seemed to be positioned lower than it should be, as if the person were crouching or lying down while looking out. Before Mr. Pearson could get a better look, the curtains fell back into place. He knocked on the back door, calling out that he'd just come to check on Thomas. No answer. But he had the distinct impression that people were inside the house, listening, waiting for him to leave. The final incident occurred on November 8th, exactly 1 week before the family's disappearance would be discovered. Elizabeth Higgins's best friend Sarah Coleman had been trying to reach her for days. They'd made plans to attend a Saturday matinee in Preston, but Elizabeth hadn't answered her telephone calls or responded to notes passed through the letter slot. Concerned, Sarah decided to wait outside the grammar school on Monday morning to catch Elizabeth before classes. She waited from 7:30 until 9 o'clock, but Elizabeth never appeared. When Sarah inquired at the office, she learned that Elizabeth hadn't attended school in over a week. Family emergency, the secretary explained, consulting her records. Her mother telephoned to say Elizabeth would be helping at home for a while. Sarah found this explanation puzzling. The Higgins family had never experienced emergencies that kept the children from school. Education was sacred to Harold and Margaret. They'd both left school at 14 to work, and they were determined their children would have better opportunities. That afternoon, Sarah walked past the Higgins house on her way home from school. She noticed that while the windows were clean and the curtains neatly hung, there were no lights visible anywhere in the house despite the early darkness of November. More strange still, there were no signs of daily life, no washing on the line, no movement behind windows, no sound of radio or television programs. The house looked exactly like what it was becoming, a stage set from which all the actors had quietly withdrawn. Sarah's mother, when told of these observations, suggested that the family might be going through private difficulties. Sometimes people need space to work things out, she said. The kindest thing we can do is respect their privacy. But privacy was becoming indistinguishable from absence. The Higgins family was methodically erasing themselves from village life, one member at a time, one responsibility at a time, one connection at a time. By early November, Harold hadn't been seen at the mill in 2 weeks. Margaret had stopped attending church entirely. The children were absent from school with vague explanations that didn't quite make sense. Their milk deliveries continued, but the bottles accumulated uncollected on the doorstep. The curtains remained drawn throughout the day, yet somehow none of these warning signs coalesced into genuine alarm. Each incident was rationalized away, explained by circumstances that sounded reasonable when considered individually. It was only when P.C. Thornton pushed open their front door on November 15th that the village was forced to confront the truth. The Higgins family hadn't been going through a difficult period. They had been systematically vanishing. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps us continue investigating these forgotten mysteries. Share this with someone who loves dark historical cases, because what we're about to discover about the Higgins family's fate will change everything you thought you knew about this case. Let's find out what happened next. Police Constable Michael Thornton had been serving the Ashworth beat for 12 years when he received the call that would define the rest of his career. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, increasingly anxious about her neighbor's prolonged absence from church and social obligations, had finally convinced herself to contact the authorities. It's probably nothing, she told the desk sergeant at Preston Police Station. But something isn't right at number 47. P.C. Thornton arrived at Elm Street on the morning of November 15th, expecting to find a family dealing with illness or private troubles. Perhaps Harold had taken a fall and was too proud to ask for help. Perhaps Margaret was caring for a sick relative. The accumulated milk bottles and drawn curtains suggested absence rather than catastrophe. The front door stood slightly ajar, unusual for a family as security-conscious as the Higginses, but not immediately alarming. P.C. Thornton knocked and called out, identifying himself. When no response came, he pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The first thing that struck him was the silence. Not just the absence of voices or movement, but a profound, almost architectural silence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The house felt hollow in a way that went beyond emptiness. The second thing he noticed was the smell, or rather, the absence of smell. Every home has its particular combination of scents: cooking, cleaning products, perfume, tobacco, the indefinable essence of human habitation. The Higgins house smelled like nothing at all, as if it had been scrubbed clean of every trace of life. P.C. Thornton moved through the ground floor systematically, his training taking over despite the growing strangeness of what he was finding. The sitting room appeared perfect, furniture arranged with museum-like precision, cushions plumped, surfaces dust-free. But there were no books open on side tables, no newspapers folded from recent reading, no glasses left from evening tea. It was a room that looked ready for company but had clearly hosted no life in weeks. The kitchen presented the scene that would haunt investigators for decades to come. 3 breakfast place settings arranged on the table with mathematical exactness, plates centered on placemats, cups positioned at identical angles, silverware laid out with ruler-straight precision. A jar of marmalade sat open in the center of the table, a butter dish beside it. Everything suggested a meal interrupted, except for the thin layer of dust that covered every surface. P.C. Thornton opened the marmalade jar and discovered it was bone dry inside. Its contents long since evaporated. The butter dish contained only a rancid yellow residue that crumbled to powder when touched. Whatever meal this table had been set for, it had been abandoned weeks ago. More disturbing still was what wasn't on the table. 3 place settings for a family of 5. 2 empty chairs pushed back from the table as if their occupants had stepped away mid-meal. But the missing places hadn't been cleared away. They had never been set at all. Moving upstairs, P.C. Thornton's unease deepened into something approaching dread. The master bedroom was immaculate, bed made with hospital corners, clothes hung in wardrobes with military precision, personal items arranged on dressing tables like museum displays. But Margaret's jewelry box stood open and empty. Harold's wallet was missing from its usual place on the dresser. The drawers that should have contained undergarments and personal belongings were completely bare. The children's bedrooms told similar stories. Beds perfectly made, school uniforms hanging ready for wear, textbooks stacked neatly on desks. But the drawers were empty. The wardrobes contained only a few items of clothing hanging like props on a stage set. Personal possessions, photographs, toys, books, letters, were completely absent. In Thomas's room, P.C. Thornton found something that made his skin crawl. The boy's desk was arranged as if for study, textbooks open, notebook positioned for writing, pen laid across the page. But when he examined the notebook more closely, he discovered that Thomas had been writing the same sentence over and over. "We are going away now. We are going away now. We are going away now." Hundreds of repetitions in increasingly shaky handwriting, covering page after page. Elizabeth's room contained a similar discovery. Her diary, usually hidden beneath her mattress, lay open on her pillow. The final entry, dated November 1st, consisted of a single phrase repeated until it filled the entire page. "Mother says we must be very quiet now." 8-year-old Robert's room was perhaps the most disturbing of all. His bed was perfectly made, but positioned in the center was his favorite toy, a wooden soldier his father had carved for his 5th birthday. The toy had been carefully dismantled, its head removed and placed beside the body, its limbs arranged in a neat row. It looked less like a child's play and more like a miniature autopsy. P.C. Thornton found himself backing out of the room, his professional composure finally cracking. Nothing in his 12 years of police work had prepared him for the psychological impact of this discovery. The house felt like a tomb, but not for the dead, for the living who had somehow been methodically erased. He radioed for backup and waited outside until Detective Inspector James Carlyle arrived from Preston. D.I. Carlyle, a veteran investigator with 30 years' experience, took one walk through the house and immediately called for a full forensics team from Manchester. "This isn't an abandonment," he told P.C. Thornton. "This is a crime scene. I just can't figure out what crime." The forensics examination would take 3 days and reveal details that defied conventional explanation. Every surface in the house had been cleaned with industrial thoroughness, but using products that weren't found anywhere on the premises. Fingerprints had been systematically removed from door handles, light switches, and personal items. But the cleaning had been done with such precision that it couldn't have been accomplished by the family themselves. More puzzling still, the house showed evidence of continued habitation long after the family should have been present. Food in the refrigerator was fresh, purchased within the previous week, but consisted only of items no member of the family particularly liked. Bread, milk, and vegetables that Margaret had never bought according to her usual shopping patterns. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined the family's personal effects more closely. Photographs had been systematically removed from frames throughout the house, but the frames remained perfectly positioned. Letters and personal documents were missing from desks and drawers, but business papers and household bills remained neatly filed. It was as if someone had methodically extracted every trace of the family's emotional life while preserving the administrative skeleton of their existence. In the garden, investigators found evidence that raised more questions than answers. Areas of soil had been recently disturbed, then carefully restored to look undisturbed. But excavation revealed nothing beneath, just earth that had been dug up and replaced for no apparent reason. The garden shed contained tools that were meticulously clean, as if they'd been thoroughly washed after use, but there was no indication what they might have been used for. The final piece of physical evidence was discovered in the cellar. Scratched into the stone wall, barely visible unless viewed from a specific angle, were words that chilled every investigator who read them. They came for us in the night. Don't let them take the children. God help us. They look just like us. The handwriting was identified as Harold's, but the message raised more questions than answers. Who were they? What did it mean that they looked just like us? And if Harold had time to leave this message, why hadn't he or any family member contacted authorities for help? D.I. Carlisle would later describe the Higgins house as the most thoroughly planned disappearance I've ever encountered, combined with the most careless abandonment of evidence I've ever seen. It's as if two completely different minds were responsible for different aspects of this crime. But what crime? No blood had been shed. No struggle had occurred. No ransom demand had been made. 5 people had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a house that looked like a museum exhibit titled English Family Life, 1965. Accurate in every detail, but completely devoid of the messy, chaotic reality of human existence. The discovery that would haunt investigators for decades was this: the Higgins family hadn't been kidnapped or murdered in any conventional sense. They had been methodically replaced, piece by piece, until nothing genuine remained. But replaced. By what? And more terrifyingly, were the replacements still out there, living other people's lives in other quiet English villages? Detective Inspector James Carlisle had investigated everything from routine burglaries to multiple murders during his 3 decades with Lancashire Constabulary, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic strangeness of the Higgins case. Within hours of examining the house on Elm Street, he realized that conventional investigative approaches would be inadequate for understanding what had occurred. The first challenge was establishing a timeline. When exactly had the family disappeared? Initial assumptions suggested they'd been missing for only a few days, but forensic examination revealed a far more complex picture. The dust patterns in the house indicated different rooms had been abandoned at different times. The master bedroom showed signs of abandonment stretching back nearly 2 months, while the kitchen appeared to have been used as recently as a week before the discovery. This staggered timeline made no sense if the family had disappeared together. It suggested instead that the Higginses had vanished incrementally, one by one or room by room, over an extended period. But how could this occur without neighbors noticing? How could Harold continue working at the mill for weeks after his bedroom showed evidence of abandonment? D.I. Carlisle decided to interview every resident of Ashworth, beginning with the family's immediate neighbors and working outward through the village's social networks. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about human observation and memory. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, who lived next door and had been most concerned about the family's welfare, provided the most detailed timeline of strange incidents. But when pressed for specific dates and times, her recollections became confused. She was certain she'd seen Margaret working in the garden in late October, but couldn't remember which evening. She'd heard Harold's raised voice in September, but the exact date eluded her. More puzzling still, other neighbors remembered seeing family members during periods when Mrs. Fletcher was certain the house had been empty. Mr. George Whitmore, who lived across the street, insisted he'd spoken with Harold about cricket scores just 3 days before P.C. Thornton's discovery. Mrs. Sarah Chen, the local postmistress, recalled Margaret collecting a package the previous week. These conflicting memories led D.I. Carlyle to a disturbing conclusion. Either the witnesses were collectively mistaken about their observations, or someone had been impersonating members of the Higgins family for weeks before their disappearance was discovered. The investigation expanded to include Harold's workplace at Blackwood Mill. Here the timeline became even more confused. Harold's supervisor, Mr. William Hayes, insisted that Harold had worked his regular shifts until the previous Friday. Payroll. Records supported this claim. Harold had been paid for a full week's work ending November 12th. But Harold's longtime colleagues told a different story. He'd been acting strange for weeks, explained Tom Morrison, who'd worked beside Harold for 15 years. Wouldn't join us for tea breaks anymore. Kept to himself. Didn't want to chat about football or family like usual. And there was something about his face. Morrison struggled to articulate his concerns. Harold looked like Harold, you understand. Same height, same build, same way of walking. But his expressions were all wrong. Like someone doing an impression of Harold rather than Harold himself. Other mill workers reported similar unease. Harold had continued performing his duties competently, but with a mechanical precision that was unlike his usual approach to work. He'd stopped telling the small jokes and sharing the minor complaints that had been part of his daily routine for 20 years. Most disturbing, he'd shown no interest in or knowledge of events in his family's life that had previously been central to his identity. I asked him how young Robert was getting on at school. Recalled Charlie Brennan, another colleague. Harold just stared at me for the longest time, like he couldn't remember who Robert was. Then he said, "The boy is well," in this flat voice. Not "Robert's doing fine," or "he's having trouble with his sums," or any of the normal things a father would say. Just, "the boy is well." It gave me the shivers. The investigation into the children's school attendance revealed similar patterns of gradual replacement. Thomas had stopped participating in classroom discussions weeks before he officially left school, according to his teachers. He'd continued completing assignments, but with handwriting that became increasingly uniform and mechanical. His essays, once filled with original thoughts and creative expression, became formulaic repetitions of standard phrases. Elizabeth's transition was more subtle but equally disturbing. Her best friend Sarah Coleman reported that their conversations had become increasingly one-sided. She'd respond to what I said, but she never initiated topics anymore, Sarah told investigators. It was like talking to a very polite stranger who happened to look like Elizabeth. Young Robert's teacher, Miss Patricia Henley, provided perhaps the most chilling account. She'd noticed that Robert had stopped bringing lunches from home, unusual for a family as attentive as the Higginses. When she asked about this, Robert explained that his mother had been too busy to prepare his usual sandwiches. But the lunches Robert began bringing were identical every day. White bread, processed cheese, and nothing else. When Miss Henley expressed concern about nutrition, Robert assured her that his mother knew what was best for him. The response was delivered in Robert's voice, with Robert's polite manner, but using phrasing that no 8-year-old would naturally employ. It was as if someone had coached him on what to say, Miss Henley explained. The words were appropriate, but they didn't sound like Robert's words. As the investigation progressed, D.I. Carlyle began to suspect that the Higgins family had been systematically replaced by impostors over a period of several weeks or months. But this theory raised questions more disturbing than the original. Mystery. Who were the impostors? How had they gained such detailed knowledge of the family's habits and relationships? And what had become of the real Higginses? The search for the family expanded throughout Lancashire and into neighboring counties. Police circulated photographs and descriptions, but the response was more confusion than clarity. Several witnesses reported seeing members of the family in locations dozens of miles apart on the same day. A shopkeeper in Preston was certain She'd served Margaret Higgins on a Tuesday, while a bus conductor in Manchester swore he'd seen Harold traveling to Bolton that same afternoon. These sightings shared a common characteristic. The people witnessed looked exactly like the Higgins family members, but their behavior seemed somehow off to those who knew them well. They were polite, appropriately dressed, and said nothing obviously wrong. But they lacked the subtle mannerisms, speech patterns, and personality quirks that make each person unique. Dr. James Morrison, the village physician, was brought in to consult on the case when D.I. Carlisle began exploring medical explanations for the family's strange behavior preceding their disappearance. Could they have been suffering from some form of collective mental illness, carbon monoxide poisoning, drug-induced psychological changes? Dr. Morrison examined the house for environmental hazards but found nothing. The gas appliances were properly ventilated, the water supply was clean, and there were no obvious sources of toxins or intoxicants. But he did notice something peculiar about the family's medicine cabinet. They'd been filling prescriptions I never wrote, Dr. Morrison told investigators. Sleeping tablets, anxiety medications, pain relievers, all legitimate prescriptions, but issued by doctors I'd never heard of for conditions I'd never diagnosed. Inquiries with chemists in neighboring towns revealed that members of the Higgins family had been visiting multiple pharmacies, filling prescriptions from various doctors for medications that, when combined, could produce profound changes in personality and memory. Someone had been systematically drugging the family, but whether they were willing participants or victims remained unclear. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything in Lancashire's judicial history. How do you prosecute a crime when you can't prove a crime has occurred? How do you declare people dead when there are no bodies? How do you explain disappearances that seem to have occurred gradually with the willing participation of the victims? Coroner's inquests were opened and immediately adjourned pending further evidence. The Higgins family's bank accounts remained untouched, suggesting they hadn't fled voluntarily, but there were no signs of violence or coercion. Insurance companies refused to pay death benefits without proof of death, but also couldn't close the claims without proof of life. The case attracted attention from Scotland Yard, who sent a team of specialists to review the evidence. Their report, classified at the time and not released until the 1990s, contained conclusions that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior. The evidence suggests a sophisticated operation designed to systematically replace the Higgins family with impostors, the report stated. The level of planning, the intimate knowledge of the family's habits and relationships, and the gradual nature of the substitution indicates an organization with resources and capabilities beyond conventional criminal enterprises. The Scotland Yard team identified what they termed replacement indicators, subtle changes in behavior that suggested the real family members had been supplanted by impostors at different times. Harold appeared to have been replaced first, sometime in early September. Margaret followed in mid-October. The children's replacements occurred in rapid succession during the final weeks of October. But the most disturbing conclusion in the classified report was this: we have identified similar patterns of gradual behavioral change and systematic disappearance in at least 12 other families across northern England during the period 1960-1965. The cases share common characteristics that suggest a coordinated operation rather than isolated incidents. D.I. Carlisle was not permitted to see this classified information at the time. His investigation was quietly reassigned to other officers, and he was transferred to a desk job in Preston with a promotion that felt more like exile. When he attempted to continue investigating the case privately, he received visits from officials who politely but firmly suggested he focus on other matters. The official conclusion, announced 6 months after the discovery, was that the Higgins family had suffered a collective psychological breakdown and fled their home together. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, but resources were redirected to other priorities. The house on Elm Street was eventually sold to pay outstanding debts, and new residents moved in who knew nothing of its history. But the unofficial investigation continued in whispers and private conversations throughout Ashworth. Residents began paying closer attention to their neighbors, watching for the subtle signs that had preceded the Higgins family's disappearance. They noticed things they'd previously ignored: small changes in familiar faces, slight alterations in long-standing habits, the gradual fading of personality quirks that had defined people for decades. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, who had first raised concerns about her neighbors, began keeping detailed notes about everyone on Elm Street. Her observations, discovered after her death in 1978, revealed a pattern of subtle changes affecting multiple families throughout the late 1960s. People she'd known for decades gradually became slightly different versions of themselves, as if their essential humanity was slowly being diluted. The pharmaceutical angle of the investigation led to several arrests, but none resulted in convictions. The doctors who had prescribed medication to the Higgins family all claimed to have legitimate medical records supporting their prescriptions, but these records were later discovered to be forgeries of extraordinary sophistication. The chemists who filled the prescriptions insisted they'd been following proper protocols, serving customers who appeared to be legitimate members of the Higgins family. By 1967, the active investigation had been quietly abandoned. The files were sealed under the Official Secrets Act, and the few remaining investigators were reassigned or retired early with generous pensions. The message was clear. Some mysteries were too dangerous to solve. PC Michael Thornton, who had first discovered the empty house, left the police force 6 months after the case was closed. He moved to Australia, where he worked as a security guard for the remainder of his career. In interviews given decades later, he maintained that the Higgins case had involved forces beyond normal criminal activity. "I've seen crime scenes where terrible things happened," he told a journalist in 1995. "Murder, violence, all the horrible things people do to each other. But that house on Elm Street was different. It wasn't just that people had been hurt or killed. It was as if they'd been erased. Not just their bodies, but their souls, their personalities, everything that made them human. Someone or something had stolen their lives so completely that there was nothing left but empty shells going through the motions of being the Higgins family." The cover-up, if it was a cover-up, was remarkably effective. Within 5 years, most residents of Ashworth had convinced themselves that the family had simply moved away without telling anyone. Children who asked about the empty house were told that the Higginses had gone to live with relatives in Canada. The official story became accepted truth through repetition, and the natural human desire to believe in reasonable explanations for unreasonable events. But some residents never forgot the feeling of unease that had pervaded the village during those final weeks before the discovery. They remembered the subtle wrongness that had surrounded the family's gradual transformation from recognizable human beings into perfect simulacra of themselves. Margaret's sister, who lived in nearby Preston, attempted to pursue her own investigation into her family's disappearance. She hired a private detective and placed advertisements in newspapers across England, seeking information about her missing relatives. The private detective's final report, submitted after 3 months of investigation, contained a single recommendation: cease all inquiries immediately. This matter involves national security considerations beyond civilian investigation. The sister never received another communication from the detective. When she attempted to contact his office, she was told that no such person had ever been employed there. The disappearance of the Higgins family marked the beginning of what researchers would later identify as a pattern of systematic vanishings that plagued rural England throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. While each case was investigated individually and often dismissed as isolated incidents of families fleeing debt or domestic troubles, retrospective analysis reveals disturbing commonalities that suggest a coordinated campaign of unknown origin and purpose. Dr. Rebecca Thornfield, a sociologist at Cambridge University who studied the phenomenon in the 1990s, identified over 40 families across northern England who disappeared under circumstances similar to the Higginses. Her research, published in the obscure Journal of Anomalous Social Phenomena, documented a clear pattern: working-class families in isolated communities, gradual behavioral changes preceding disappearance, evidence of systematic replacement by impostors, and official investigations that were quickly closed or classified. What we're looking at, Dr. Thornfield concluded, is either the most sophisticated criminal organization in British history or something else entirely. The level of coordination, the intimate knowledge of family dynamics, and the ability to produce perfect physical doubles of multiple family members simultaneously suggest capabilities beyond conventional explanation. The implications of the Higgins case extended far beyond a single missing family. If the Scotland Yard assessment was correct, that This represented part of a larger operation, affecting dozens of families, then the social fabric of rural England had been quietly infiltrated and altered in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and community. Villages throughout Lancashire, Yorkshire, and Cumbria began experiencing similar patterns of gradual estrangement and unexplained disappearances. The phenomenon seemed to target specific types of families, stable, well integrated into their communities, with children of school age, and no close relatives living nearby who might notice subtle behavioral changes. The selection criteria suggested a purpose beyond random criminal activity. Someone or some organization was systematically removing families that represented ideal specimens of English working-class life, replacing them with perfect mimics who could maintain social roles while lacking authentic human emotional responses. Several theories emerged to explain the phenomenon, each more disturbing than the last. The most conventional explanation suggested a human trafficking operation of unprecedented sophistication, targeting entire families for reasons unknown. But this theory failed to account for the precision of the replacements or the complete absence of financial motivation. More speculative theories proposed government experimentation related to Cold War concerns about social control and population management. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that both British and American intelligence agencies had conducted extensive research into techniques for altering personality and behavior during this period. Could the Higgins family have been subjects in some form of psychological warfare experiment? The most disturbing theory, advanced by a handful of researchers willing to risk professional ridicule, suggested non-human intelligence was responsible for the systematic replacement of human families. This theory, while lacking credible evidence, was the only one that adequately explained the impossible level of knowledge and capability demonstrated by whoever was responsible for the disappearances. The impact on affected communities was profound and lasting. Trust between neighbors eroded as residents began watching each other for signs of the subtle changes that had preceded the Higgins family's disappearance. Children were taught to report any unusual behavior from family members or friends. The natural bonds of community solidarity were replaced by a paranoid vigilance that fundamentally altered social dynamics in rural English villages. Schools began implementing new procedures for monitoring student behavior and family dynamics. Teachers were trained to recognize signs of gradual personality change and to report concerns to authorities immediately. These measures, while ostensibly protective, created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that damaged the traditional trust between families and educational institutions. The phenomenon also influenced broader cultural attitudes toward conformity and social integration. The ideal of the stable, well-integrated family became associated with vulnerability rather than strength. Families that were too perfect, too well-adjusted, too deeply embedded in community life became objects of suspicion rather than admiration. Legal systems struggled to adapt to crimes that defied conventional categories. How do you prosecute identity theft when the theft involves not just names and documents, but complete personalities and life histories? How do you prove murder when there are no bodies and the victims appear to be living normal lives in full view of their communities? The Higgins case and similar incidents led to changes in missing persons procedures throughout England. Police were trained to look for signs of gradual replacement rather than sudden disappearance. New protocols were established for verifying the identity of family members who claimed their missing relatives had returned home safely. Insurance companies began requiring more extensive documentation before processing claims related to missing persons. The possibility that policyholders might be systematically replaced by impostors created unprecedented challenges for risk assessment and fraud prevention. Perhaps most significantly, the phenomenon influenced a generation of children who grew up in affected communities. These individuals, now in their 60s and 70s, report lasting psychological effects from the constant fear that their parents, siblings, or friends might be gradually replaced by perfect strangers wearing familiar faces. Dr. Margaret Winthrop, a clinical psychologist who has treated survivors of affected communities, describes a specific form of anxiety she terms replacement syndrome, the persistent fear that loved ones are not who they appear to be. Patients report examining family members for subtle signs of behavioral change, testing them with personal questions, and feeling unable to trust their own perceptions of familiar people. The Higgins case and similar incidents created a form of collective trauma that persists decades later, Dr. Winthrop explains. These communities learned that the people they loved and trusted could be systematically replaced by perfect imitations. The psychological impact of that realization doesn't simply disappear when the immediate threat ends. The broader implications extend beyond individual psychology to questions about the nature of identity and humanity itself. If people can be so completely replicated that even their closest family members don't notice the substitution for weeks or months, what does that suggest about the essence of human individuality? The phenomenon also raised questions about social observation and community bonds that remain relevant today. How well do we actually know our neighbors? Would we notice if someone we see regularly was gradually replaced by a perfect double? The Higgins case suggests that the answer might be more disturbing than we'd like to believe. Modern researchers studying the case have noted parallels to contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence, deepfake technology, and digital identity manipulation. While the methods may have been different, the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do we verify that the people in our lives are actually who they claim to be? The legacy of the Higgins family disappearance continues to influence academic research into social psychology, community dynamics, and anomalous phenomena. Universities across England now offer courses examining the case as an example of how entire communities can collectively deny obvious signs of systematic deception when the truth is too disturbing to acknowledge. The case has also inspired numerous works of fiction, though most authors have found it necessary to provide more conventional explanations for the family's disappearance than the evidence actually supports. The truth of what happened to the Higginses remains too strange for most readers to accept. Even in fictional form, what cannot be disputed is that the disappearance of 5 people from a quiet Lancashire village in 1965 revealed vulnerabilities in the fabric of English society that few had previously imagined. The case demonstrated that entire families could be systematically erased and replaced without anyone noticing until it was far too late to prevent or reverse the process. The question that haunts researchers 60 years later is not just what happened to the Higgins family, but how many other families suffered similar fates without anyone ever realizing they were gone. What do you think was truly responsible for the systematic replacement of the Higgins family? Was this an elaborate criminal conspiracy, government experimentation, or something even more disturbing? The evidence suggests capabilities beyond conventional explanation, but the truth remains hidden behind decades of official silence. Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community of mystery seekers always brings fascinating perspectives to these historical puzzles. What signs would you watch for if you suspected someone in your life was gradually being replaced? How well do you actually know the people closest to you? The classified files from this case won't be fully released until 2045, assuming they still exist. Until then, we can only piece together fragments of a truth that someone clearly wanted to keep hidden. Subscribe to the Lost Relics for more investigations into the dark corners of history that official records prefer to forget. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the past. The empty house on Elm Street still stands today, occupied by families who know nothing of what happened there 60 years ago. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights moving through the rooms in patterns that don't quite match human habitation. Some mysteries are solved. Others simply learn to hide better. See you in the next investigation.